Imagine you're a bloodthirsty pirate. You've spent the last 6 months robbing Spanish galleons, stabbing people for sport, and using the Bible as toilet paper. Then December rolls around and suddenly, you're sitting on a rotten plank deck, holding hands with Stabby Jim, singing hymns you half remember from childhood while tears stream down your sun-damaged face. There's a parrot screaming in the background. Someone's vomiting overboard. The captain just declared it's Christmas because it feels like Christmas. Welcome to Pirate Holiday spirit. Yeah, that's right. Pirates celebrated Christmas, sort of, but not in the wholesome Hallmark movie way you're imagining. We're talking about a floating collection of criminals, deserters, and social outcasts who spent most of the year stealing from the rich and occasionally eating their boots when supplies ran low. So when December rolled around and they were stuck in the middle of the Atlantic with nothing but salt water, hardtack, and each other, things got weird. The Golden Age of Piracy, roughly 1650 to 1730, was a time when European empires were shipping gold, spices, and enslaved people across the ocean, and pirates were there to intercept the party. These weren't the romanticized Jack Sparrow types. They were mostly former sailors, escaped slaves, and men fleeing debt or execution. And yes, many of them came from Christian backgrounds, which meant Christmas wasn't completely foreign to them. But celebrating it while drunk, sunburned, and possibly dying of scurvy, that required some creative adaptation. Now before we dive into the rum-soaked chaos of pirate holidays, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Because after this video, you're going to need a therapist and a history degree, and I can't provide either, but I can provide more disturbing historical facts that'll make you question everything. Number 10. Most pirates didn't even know what day it was. Imagine trying to celebrate Christmas when you haven't seen land in 3 months. Your calendar got soaked in seawater back in September, and the only guy who could read drowned during a storm. Welcome to pirate time management. Here's the thing. Most pirate crews had absolutely no idea what day it was, let alone when Christmas fell. Ships didn't exactly come equipped with wall calendars, and the average pirate wasn't educated enough to track dates using astronomical observations. If you were lucky, someone on board, usually the navigator or a former merchant sailor, might have kept a rough log. But even then, after months at sea with no port stops, dates became fuzzy. Add in the fact that different Christian denominations celebrated Christmas on different days. Some stuck to the Julian calendar, others had switched to Gregorian, and you had a recipe for confusion. So for many pirate crews, Christmas was less of a specific date and more of a vibe. If someone remembered it was supposed to be around late December and the weather was miserable enough to feel festive, they'd just declare it Christmas and move on. Think of it like when you're on vacation and lose track of what day of the week it is, except instead of margaritas and poolside naps, you're surrounded by scurvy, rats, and the constant threat of being hanged. Festive. The irony? Pirates were incredibly precise about other things, like dividing loot, tracking enemy ships, or calculating how much rum each man was owed. But Christmas? Close enough. Basically, pirates treated Christmas the same way most of us treat our New Year's resolutions. We know it's important, but we're not keeping track. Number 9, they absolutely drank themselves stupid. You know what pirates did care about? Alcohol. And if there was ever an excuse to break out the good stuff, Christmas was it. Rum was the lifeblood of pirate culture. Not just because it tasted better than the brackish water they were forced to drink, but because it kept morale high and diseases at bay. Well, sort of. The Royal Navy had a daily rum ration for sailors, and pirates just scaled that up. Way up. On a normal day, a pirate might get a pint or two. On Christmas, all bets were off. Captains would often open up the ship's stores and let the crew drink as much as they wanted, which sounds generous until you realize it was also a strategic move to keep everyone too drunk to mutiny. But here's where it gets interesting. Some pirate crews treated Christmas drinking as a semi-religious act. Remember, many of these men grew up in Christian households where Christmas involved church, family, and a special meal. So even though they'd abandoned society, some of that cultural memory lingered. They'd toast to Jesus, sing hymns badly, and maybe even say a prayer before passing out on the deck. It was like a chaotic blend of sacrilege and sentimentality, Part worship service, part frat party. Of course, not everyone was into it. Some captains, especially the more pragmatic ones, limited the drinking because a ship full of blackout drunk pirates is a floating disaster waiting to happen. Imagine trying to navigate a storm when your entire crew is vomiting overboard and singing off-key sea shanties. But for the most part, Christmas was one of the few days when discipline took a backseat to debauchery. The punchline? Pirates probably celebrated Christmas more enthusiastically than most of the civilized people back on land. Because when your everyday life involves scurvy, shark attacks, and the constant threat of execution, any excuse to get wasted is a good one. Number 8. Some crews actually sang hymns while drunk. Picture this. You're a Spanish merchant captain, minding your own business, sailing through the Caribbean, when suddenly you hear singing. Not threatening war chants or the sound of cannons being loaded, actual hymns. Church music. Coming from a pirate ship. You'd think you were hallucinating from heat stroke, but nope. That's just Christmas on the high seas. A surprising number of pirate crews maintained at least a surface-level connection to Christianity, and Christmas brought that out in bizarre ways. Many pirates, especially those from English, Dutch, or French backgrounds, grew up attending church and knew the traditional carols. So when Christmas rolled around, some crews would gather on deck and belt out hymns like "God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen," or psalms they remembered from childhood. The catch? They were usually hammered, standing on a stolen ship, surrounded by stolen goods, possibly with blood still on their clothes from the last raid. The cognitive dissonance was wild. These were men who spent 364 days a year violating pretty much every commandment in the book. But on Christmas? Time to sing about the birth of Christ and reflect on moral goodness. Some historians think this was genuine religious sentiment breaking through, a moment where pirates reconnected with their lost innocence or sought spiritual comfort. Others argue it was just tradition for tradition's sake, a nostalgic callback to life before they became outlaws. But here's the kicker. Not all pirates were Christian. Crews were incredibly diverse, including escaped slaves from Africa, indigenous people from the Americas, and sailors from Muslim-majority countries. So while some guys were singing hymns, others were probably just confused or participating ironically. Imagine being a formerly enslaved African man who escaped a Christian slave owner's plantation, only to end up on a pirate ship where your crewmates are drunkenly praising Jesus. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Basically, pirate Christmas hymns were less holy night and more chaotic night where everyone pretends they're not going to hell. Number 7. Special meals. If they had any food left. Christmas dinner on a pirate ship was like a game show where the grand prize is something that won't give you dysentery. If the crew was lucky, meaning they'd recently raided a merchant vessel or stopped at a port, they might have access to actual food instead of the usual nightmare rations. Let's talk about what pirates normally ate, because it's horrifying. Your standard pirate diet consisted of hardtack, basically indestructible biscuits that were often infested with weevils, salted meat that had been preserved so long it could survive a nuclear apocalypse, and whatever fish they managed to catch. Fresh fruit and vegetables, almost never, which is why scurvy was rampant. So when Christmas came around, if they had anything remotely special, cured ham, dried fruits, nuts, preserved citrus, maybe even some cheese that hadn't completely rotted, it became the feast of the century. Some pirate captains would save luxury items specifically for Christmas. Think stolen wine, sugar, spices, or even chocolate if they'd hit a Spanish treasure ship. The goal was to boost morale and remind the crew why they chose piracy in the first place, the occasional taste of the good life, even if that good life was temporary and surrounded by death. But here's where it gets dark. If a pirate crew hadn't captured anything recently and supplies were running low, Christmas could be genuinely bleak. There are accounts of ships where men were already on starvation rations, and Christmas just highlighted how desperate things had become. In extreme cases, crews might slaughter one of the ship's animals, goats, chickens, or pigs kept for emergencies, and that became the Christmas meal. Nothing says peace on earth like eating your emergency livestock while floating aimlessly in the Atlantic. And if things were really bad, some crews resorted to drawing lots to see who would be eaten. I'm not joking. Maritime cannibalism was rare but documented, and while it usually didn't happen on Christmas specifically, the holiday season at sea could push desperate men to unthinkable extremes. So yeah, pirate Christmas dinner was either surprisingly decent stolen food or dystopian survival horror, no in between. Number 6, they didn't exchange gifts, they gambled for them. Forget Secret Santa. Pirates had a much more chaotic system for Christmas gift-giving. Gambling. Lots of gambling. With everything on the line. Pirates loved gambling. Dice games, card games, betting on literally anything. It was one of the main forms of entertainment on long voyages. And Christmas provided the perfect excuse to make it even more intense. Crews would organize tournaments where men could win extra rum rations, better sleeping spots, or even shares of future loot. Some captains encouraged it because it kept morale up and gave men something to focus on besides the fact that they were probably going to die at sea. But the stakes could get weirdly personal. Pirates would bet their clothes, weapons, or even their share of the next prize. There are accounts of men gambling away months of earnings in a single Christmas night, then waking up the next day with nothing but regret and a hangover. It was like Black Friday shopping, except instead of buying stuff you don't need, you're losing stuff you do need to a guy named Mad Dog Jenkins who cheats at cards. Some crews had rules against excessive gambling because it caused too many fights. Picture this. You lose your favorite pistol to your crewmate on Christmas, then 3 days later, you're supposed to trust him to watch your back during a raid. Awkward. Captains who wanted to maintain discipline would limit gambling or ban it entirely during the holidays, but enforcement was tricky when everyone, including the captain, was drunk. The real irony? Pirates operated on surprisingly democratic principles. They voted on major decisions, divided loot fairly, and had written codes of conduct. But on Christmas, all that structure went out the window, and it became a free-for-all of drunken gambling and questionable life choices. Kind of like how modern families claim to love each other until someone brings up politics at Christmas dinner. Number 5. Captains sometimes gave speeches about mortality. Here's something you wouldn't expect. Some pirate captains used Christmas as an opportunity to get philosophical. And by philosophical, I mean they'd gather the crew and deliver speeches about how they were all probably going to die horribly soon, so they might as well enjoy the moment. Pirate captains were an interesting breed. Some were barely literate thugs who ruled through fear and violence, but others, especially those who'd been naval officers or privateers before turning to piracy, were surprisingly articulate and understood the psychology of leadership. They knew that Christmas made men reflective, homesick, and vulnerable. So instead of ignoring those feelings, smart captains would address them head-on with speeches that were part motivational, part existential crisis. These speeches usually followed a formula. Acknowledge that everyone's far from home. Remind them why they chose this life. Freedom, wealth, escape from poverty or the Navy. Admit that death is always close, and then pivot to, but we're brothers and we'll face it together. It was like a TED Talk written by someone with a death wish. Some captains would quote the Bible. Others would reference ancient warriors or mythology. The goal was to transform despair into defiant camaraderie, to make the crew feel like they were part of something bigger than just theft and survival. But here's the thing. These speeches worked. Humans are narrative creatures. We need stories to make sense of suffering. And pirates, who'd often been rejected by society, found meaning in the idea that they were outlaws by choice, not circumstance. Christmas speeches reinforced that identity. They turned a depressing holiday far from home into a moment of solidarity and purpose. Of course, not every captain was this thoughtful. Some just stood up, said don't die, drink more rum, and called it a day. But the captains who understood storytelling and symbolism, they could keep crews loyal even during the worst conditions. Because when you're living on borrowed time in a world that wants you dead, a good story might be the only gift that matters. Number 4. They absolutely did not stop raiding. You know what's not a pirate Christmas tradition? Peace on earth and goodwill toward men. If a merchant ship crossed their path on December 25th, pirates attacked it without hesitation. Christmas wasn't a truce. It was just another workday with slightly better alcohol. This is where the Hollywood version of pirates falls apart. In movies, there's always some romantic notion of honor among thieves, a code that means something. And yes, pirates did have codes, but those codes were about internal crew governance, not external mercy. The pirate code said things like, every man gets an equal vote, and no fighting on board. But it definitely didn't say be nice to merchants during the holidays. In fact, Christmas could be an advantageous time to attack. Why? Because merchant vessels and naval ships often let their guard down during the holidays. Crews would be celebrating, discipline would be relaxed, and everyone would be at least a little drunk. Pirates exploited that. There are documented cases of successful Christmas raids precisely because the target ship was too busy celebrating to notice the black flag approaching until it was too late. The psychological warfare aspect was brutal too. Imagine being a merchant sailor, spending Christmas with your crewmates, maybe thinking about your family back home, sharing a special meal, and then suddenly you're being boarded by pirates who clearly don't care that it's supposed to be the season of peace. That kind of shock made resistance less likely. People would surrender faster when they realized the attackers had zero respect for sacred days. But here's where it gets complicated. Some pirate captains would show mercy on Christmas, not out of religious sentiment, but out of practicality. If they captured a ship on Christmas and the crew surrendered peacefully, the captain might let them go with minimal violence, partly because happy prisoners caused fewer problems, and partly because word would spread that this particular pirate showed honor. That reputation could make future raids easier. So Pirate Christmas wasn't about stopping violence. It was about strategic violence with slightly better food. Number 3. Homesickness was very real and very ignored. Let's get real for a second. Christmas on a pirate ship wasn't all fun and games. For many men, it was the hardest day of the year, a painful reminder of everything they'd lost or left behind. Most pirates didn't choose this life because it was glamorous. They chose it because the alternatives were worse: poverty, press-ganged naval service, slavery, or execution. Many had families they'd never see again. Some had children who didn't know they existed. Others had fled communities where they would have been killed for their crimes, their religion, or their sexuality. So when Christmas rolled around, a holiday that's fundamentally about family and home, the emotional weight was crushing. But here's the thing about pirate culture. You didn't talk about it. Showing vulnerability could get you labeled as weak, and weakness on a pirate ship meant you'd be exploited, abandoned, or worse. So men dealt with homesickness by drinking more, working harder, or starting fights. Anything to avoid sitting with those feelings. The only socially acceptable outlet was singing. Those drunk hymns we talked about earlier weren't just religious. They were emotional release valves for men who had no other way to express grief or longing. Some crews had unofficial listener roles, usually older pirates who'd been at sea for decades and understood the psychological toll. These men would let younger sailors vent during the holidays, offering advice or just presence. It was the closest thing pirates had to mental health support, and it was entirely informal and unspoken. The darkest part? Some men didn't survive the emotional crash. There are accounts of pirates who became suicidally depressed during the holiday season, especially if the ship had been at sea for months without capturing anything valuable. A few would jump overboard. Others would pick fights they knew they'd lose. Christmas at sea could literally kill you, not through violence or disease, but through despair. So yeah, when pirates drank themselves stupid on Christmas, it wasn't just celebration. It was self-medication, because acknowledging that you'd never see home again, that you'd die alone on a ship surrounded by strangers, was too much to bear sober. Number 2, some pirates practiced Matalotage, and Christmas made it complicated. All right, we need to talk about Matalotage because it's one of the most fascinating and deliberately ignored aspects of pirate culture. And Christmas brought it into sharp focus. Matalotage was a formalized partnership between two pirates where they shared everything: earnings, property, and often a bunk. These partnerships were legally recognized within pirate society, and if one partner died, the other inherited his share of the loot. On paper, it sounds like a practical arrangement for survival. But historians have noted that many of these partnerships were romantic or sexual in nature. Essentially, same-sex unions in an era when that could get you executed on land. Pirate ships were uniquely tolerant spaces. When you're already outlaws facing execution, additional crimes like homosexuality didn't carry the same weight. The Caribbean pirate havens, places like Nassau or Tortuga, became refuges for people fleeing all sorts of persecution, including sexual minorities. So while European society was burning people at the stake for sodomy, pirate crews just shrugged and said, "As long as you pull your weight during raids, we don't care." But Christmas complicated this. Remember, Christmas was tied to Christian traditions, and Christianity explicitly condemned homosexuality. So men in Matalotage partnerships faced a weird cognitive dissonance on Christmas. Participate in the religious observance and implicitly condemn your own relationship, or skip it and risk seeming disrespectful to the crew. Most just drank through the awkwardness and didn't think about it too hard. There's also evidence that some pirates used Christmas as an opportunity to formalize their Matalotage partnerships. Since crews were already gathering for speeches and toasts, some captains would acknowledge new partnerships during Christmas celebrations. Essentially, pirate marriage ceremonies. These weren't religious, obviously, but they carried social weight. Your matlaw was your family, especially if you'd left your biological family behind. The really interesting part? Some pirates in Matalotage relationships would exchange small gifts on Christmas, carved trinkets, stolen jewelry, or practical items like knives or clothing. It was one of the few times pirate culture allowed for open sentimentality. And while the historical record is frustratingly vague, because who's going to write detailed accounts of illegal gay relationships in the 1700s, enough references exist to suggest that Christmas brought out the romantic side of these partnerships. Basically, pirate ships were accidentally progressive spaces where same-sex couples could exist openly, and Christmas was when that existence became most visible, which is ironic, considering the holiday's religious context. Number 1, they made up their own traditions, because why not? Here's the beautiful chaos of pirate Christmas. Since there were no rules and no authority figures enforcing proper celebrations, crews just invented whatever traditions they wanted, and some of them were absolutely unhinged. Different ships developed completely unique Christmas customs based on their captain's personality, the crew's cultural background, or just random decisions someone made while drunk. Some crews held mock trials on Christmas where they'd charge crewmates with ridiculous crimes, like being too ugly or snoring too loud, and the punishment was always something absurd, like having to dance on the mainmast or drink a gallon of seawater mixed with rum. It was like an early version of roasting your friends, except with more potential for actual violence. Other ships had Christmas contests. Who could climb the rigging fastest? Who could shoot the most accurate cannon? Or who could drink the most without passing out? Winners got extra shares of the next prize, or symbolic titles like King of Christmas, that meant absolutely nothing, but felt important when you were hammered. One account describes a crew that held an annual Christmas ugly boot competition, where pirates decorated their boots with whatever materials they could find, feathers, stolen jewelry, fish bones, and the winner got to skip watch duty for a week. Some crews practiced Christmas reversals, where the lowest-ranking sailor got to be captain for a day, and the actual captain had to follow orders. This sounds fun until you realize it often ended in near mutiny or actual fights, which is probably why most captains banned it. But the ones who allowed it understood that letting the crew blow off steam, even at the captain's expense, could prevent real rebellions later. And then there were the genuinely weird traditions. Some ships would capture a seabird on Christmas and declare it the Christmas bird, keeping it as a pet for the rest of the voyage. Others would write messages to their families, even though they knew they'd never send them, and then burn them at midnight while making wishes. It was like therapeutic letter writing combined with pagan ritual, which is very on-brand for pirates. The point is, pirates didn't wait for permission or tradition to tell them how to celebrate. They created their own meaning in a world that offered them none. And honestly, that's more in the spirit of Christmas than most of what we do today, minus the theft and murder, obviously. So what's the lesson here? If history teaches us anything, it's that humans will find ways to celebrate and create meaning even in the most hostile, absurd circumstances. Pirates were society's rejects, criminals, deserters, escaped slaves, religious minorities, and social outcasts. Yet they still carved out moments of joy, connection, and tradition while floating in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by death. And maybe that's weirdly hopeful, because if pirates, literal outlaws who spent most of their time stealing and occasionally eating each other, could find reasons to sing, share meals, and acknowledge something bigger than survival, then maybe we're not doing so bad either. Our modern Christmases might be commercialized and stressful, but at least we're not gambling away our shoes or dealing with scurvy. Though honestly, given how chaotic family gatherings can be, maybe we're not that far removed from Pirate Christmas after all. We've just replaced the ship with a dining room and the rum with wine. The emotional damage remains the same. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.